Let me tell you about a man who walked into a sale barn in New Mexico with the price of his whole working life folded into his shirt pocket, and walked out owning 24 animals the rest of the county had already given up on. It was the fall of 1977, out in Socorro County, in the little town of Magdalena. If you have ever been through that part of the state, you know the country. High and dry and open, the grass thin and gold, the bare mountains standing off to the north, and the great flat bowl of the plains of San Agustin running west toward Datil until the land just gives out into sky. Magdalena had been a shipping town once, back when they drove sheep and cattle down out of the high country and loaded them onto rail cars bound for market. By that autumn, the big drives were long over, but the sale barn still ran on Saturdays. And on Saturdays, the whole ranching country came in off the mesas to buy and sell and stand around and talk. Now here is the man I want you to meet. His name was Amado Sedillo, and he was 67 years old that fall. A quiet man, the kind of man who could stand at the rail of an auction ring for 2 hours and never say a word, and you would forget he was there until you turned and found him watching everything with those steady dark eyes. He had a small place south of town, down toward the Rio Salado, a few hundred acres of dry ground that had been in his family since before New Mexico was a state. He wore the same canvas coat he had worn for 20 years, and his hands were the hands of a man who had done everything on that land himself. And here is the part that matters. That past winter, in the cold heart of January, Amado had buried his wife. Her name was Delfina, and they had been married 44 years. She was a weaver. All her life, in the back room of their little adobe house, she had kept a loom. An old, upright loom her own mother had passed to her. And on it, she had made blankets and rugs of a kind you do not see much anymore. She spun her own yarn. She dyed it with things she gathered off the land. And the wool she spun was a particular wool, long and clean and strong. And Amado had spent 44 years hauling that wool, washing that wool, and watching his wife's hands turn it into something that outlived the sheep it came from. When she died, the loom went quiet. And a quiet loom in an empty house is a hard thing for a man to live beside. So that fall, Amado made a decision that set the whole town to talking. And I need you to understand it, because everyone else in that country misunderstood it completely. He sold his tractor. It was a Ford tractor, gray and red, a machine he and Delfina had bought new back in 1952 and had run for 25 years. That tractor had cut every stack of hay he had ever fed, had pulled him out of every wash he had ever bogged down in. Men in that country will tell you a rancher's tractor is the last thing he sells, the way a fiddler sells his fiddle only when he has nothing else left in the world. But 3 days before that Saturday, Amado had sold his Ford to a neighbor down the road, a younger man named Reuben Tafoya, and he had taken the cash for it. What almost nobody saw was the small thing he did first. Before Reuben drove it off, Amado took a screwdriver and quietly unscrewed the little oval Ford emblem from the front of that tractor, and he slipped it into his pocket, and he said nothing about it to anybody. Then he folded the money into his shirt and drove into Magdalena to the Saturday sale. The sale ran all afternoon. Fat black cattle came through the ring, and buyers from as far as Belen bid them up. Good stout Rambouillet ewes came through, the fine wool sheep that country prized, white and heavy and worth real money. And the fine wool men leaned on the rail and bought them by the truckload. Amado sat through all of it and never lifted a hand. And then, at the very end of the day, when the good stock was sold and the crowd was thinning out, and men were already walking to their trucks, they brought in the last pen. Now here is what you need to understand about that last pen. It was a bunch of sheep out of an estate up north, an old outfit that had folded, and nobody had wanted to fool with them, so they had been hauled down and dumped at the tail end of the sale to be gotten rid of. 24 ewes and 1 ram, and they were, by every measure that crowd used, a sorry-looking lot. Thin, rangy, leggy and narrow, with long coarse coats that hung off them in ropes instead of the tight fine fleece the buyers wanted. Some of them had horns, which ewes are not supposed to have, and the ram, when they ran him in, had 4 horns on his head, 2 curling down and 2 standing up, so that a couple of young fellows at the rail laughed out loud, and one of them hollered that they had brought a goat and a devil both. The auctioneer barely tried. He called them mixed wool sheep, no papers, and he started them low and got no takers. And he was about half a breath from no selling the whole pen and sending them to the killer buyer for next to nothing. And that is when Amado Sedillo stood up off the rail and raised his hand. Because here is the thing that whole yard did not know. Amado had spent 44 years living beside Delfina's loom. And he knew that long, ropey, coarse-looking wool the moment they ran those sheep into the light. He knew the two coats on it, the long outer hair and the soft inner wool underneath. He knew it did not carry the heavy grease the fine wool did. And he knew it took color like nothing else. And he knew it was the exact wool his wife had spun her whole life and could no longer buy anywhere. Because these sheep, this old worn-down, leggy, four-horned kind, had all but vanished from the earth. He was not looking at a pen of culls. He was looking at the last of something. He bid the tractor money. He bought the whole pen, ewes and ram together, for less than the price of one good Rambouillet. And when the auctioneer knocked them down to him, the men who were still standing around turned and looked at the quiet old widower, who had just sold his tractor to buy a load of worthless woolies. And some of them laughed. And Reuben Tafoya, who was driving Amado's own Ford now, shook his head slow and said, loud enough to carry, that grief did strange things to a good man. Amado did not answer him. He backed his old stock truck up to the loading chute as the sun went down behind the daddles. And he loaded those 24 thin sheep and that four-horned ram one at a time, calm and unhurried, in the cold dusk. And as he shut the tailgate, he was the only man in that whole yard who knew what he was hauling home. Here is something worth knowing. Those sheep were Navajo churro, the oldest breed of sheep in the Americas, brought up from Spain more than 400 years ago, and raised for centuries by the Spanish and the Navajo of the Southwest. They are lean and drought-hardy, and they grow a rare double coat of long, low-grease wool in natural browns, grays, and blacks. By the 1970s, they had been crossbred and slaughtered down almost to nothing, dismissed as scrub sheep. A handful of people understood that a whole living history was about to disappear. Now here is what you need to understand about what came next. Buying a thing is easy. Any man with money in his shirt can raise his hand at a sale. What came after the sale is where the real story lives, and it is the part nobody in Magdalena bothered to watch. Amado hauled those 24 ewes and the four-horned ram home in the dark, down the long dirt road south of town to his little place below the Bear Mountains, out where the plains of San Agustin start to break up into cedar and rock. When he turned them out of the truck into his corral by lantern light that first night, even he had to admit they were a pitiful sight. Ribs you could count. Feet gone bad from standing in the wet lots of a folded outfit, wool matted and full of burrs and stickers from range nobody had tended. A couple of the old ewes could barely walk. If a neighbor had driven by right then and looked over the fence, he would have seen exactly what the whole town already believed, that a grieving old man had thrown away his tractor on a pen of dying sheep. And the neighbors did drive by. Word had gone around the country fast, the way word does out there. And for a good many weeks that fall and winter, Amado Sedillo was the joke of the coffee counter in Magdalena. They said the old man had lost his judgment along with his wife. They said he would have those woolies buried in a snowbank by spring. Reuben Tafoya, riding high on Amado's own Ford tractor now, told anybody who would listen that he had bought the machine off a man who had gone soft in the head. Amado heard all of it, the way you always hear what is said about you in a small county. He never argued a word of it. He just went to work. And the work was patient, slow, unglamorous work, the kind that does not look like anything to a man passing by. Every morning that winter, he was out in the cold before light, carrying feed. He had sold his tractor, remember, so there was no machine to lift a bale, no cab to sit warm in. He hauled hay by hand and by wheelbarrow. He gentled those wild range ewes one at a time until they would come to his voice. He caught up every animal that was lame, and he trimmed and doctored their feet, standing them in copper sulfate to clear the foot rot they had brought with them, working on them in the corral with his bare hands going numb in the January wind. He wormed them, and he fed them a little grain against the cold. It took him most of the winter, but by the time the first warm days came, those 24 sheep had begun, slowly, to lift their heads. And here is the thing that started to turn in Amado's mind that winter. The thing the coffee counter never guessed. He watched those churro sheep on his dry, thin country, and he saw that they belonged there. His ground was hard ground, sparse grass and cedar, and not much water. A band of fine wool Rambouillet would have needed hay hauled to them all winter, and would have come through poor and thin. But these old sheep, once he got them sound, foraged that dry range the way deer forage it. They walked out farther for feed and came back in better flesh. They watered light. They shrugged off the cold and the dry the way nothing else on that land did. They had been raised for 400 years on exactly this kind of hard, high desert, and it showed. The sheep everyone called worthless were, on Amado's ground, the toughest animals he had ever kept. But the wool was the heart of it, and this is where his 44 years beside Delfina came back to him. Come spring, he sheared them himself, slow, on a plank floor in the barn, and he learned as he went that this was not like shearing the fine wool sheep he had helped with in his younger days. This was a double coat, a long, coarse outer hair with a soft, fine wool grown in close underneath it, and it did not come off in one tight fleece. He learned to skirt it and to sort it, to pull the long outer coat apart from the soft inner, because he remembered Delfina doing exactly that at their kitchen table, her fingers separating the two by feel while she talked to him about nothing at all. And when he had it sorted, spread out clean on the barn floor, he saw the colors come up out of it. Deep chocolate browns and soft silver grays and a black that was almost blue. All of it natural. All of it grown right on the sheep. Not a drop of dye in any of it. So that spring, Amado loaded his first clip of churro wool into the truck and drove it up to the wool buyer in Socorro. The same buyer the whole country sold to. And the buyer took one look at it, ran it through his fingers and turned it down flat. Too coarse, he said. Too much hair in it. Not the fine, tight, greasy wool the mills wanted for cloth. He said he might give a few pennies a pound for it to be hauled off and used for carpet backing or insulation, and that was being generous. It was, to that buyer, junk wool off junk sheep. Amado loaded it back into his truck and hauled it home. And if you had been the kind of man who laughs at another man's trouble, that would have been the day to laugh. But Amado did not haul that wool to the dump. He hauled it into the back room. He carried those sacks of brown and gray and near black wool into Delfina's cold weaving room, and he set them down beside her silent loom. And he began, in the evenings, to sort and clean and store it, the way he had watched her do it 1,000 times. And here is where the grief lived in this story, quiet and steady under everything else. He would sit in that room at night with the wool his wife had loved and could no longer spin, running it through his own rough hands, and he would talk to her a little, the way widowers do, telling her about the sheep, telling her the black ewe had settled and the old lame one had come sound. He was not keeping those sheep to prove anybody wrong. He hardly thought about the men at the coffee counter at all. He was keeping them because their wool was the last thread that still ran back to her hands, and he could not let it go. And that is the part that matters. The whole town thought he was raising sheep. He was really keeping company with his wife. The winter ran out. Spring came dry that year. The kind of dry spring that thins a lamb crop and puts worry in every rancher's face across the plains. And out on Amado's hard little place, in that dry spring, those 24 scorned churro ewes began to lamb. And they did not lamb the way tired, marginal sheep lamb. They dropped their lambs quick and clean out on the range, and they got up and mothered them. And the lambs were up and sucking and strong within the hour, and a good many of the ewes had twins, while the big fine wool flocks up the country were losing lambs to the dry and the cold. The sheep the whole town had laughed at were raising nearly every one they threw. Here is something worth knowing. Navajo churro ewes are famous among the people who keep them for easy lambing and strong mothering, and they hold up in drought where finer wool breeds fail. Their low-grease wool sheds dirt and takes natural dye deeply, which is why hand weavers prize it. For centuries in the Southwest, a family's whole cloth came off sheep like these, and the animals were bred less for the fat, uniform fleece the mills wanted than for the ability to live and thrive and raise their young on hard, dry, unforgiving land. Now here is where the story turns, and I want you to notice how it turned, because it did not turn the way you might expect. Nobody in Magdalena woke up one morning and decided they had been wrong about Amado Sedillo. The change did not come from the men who had laughed. It came from a stranger, from far off, who understood in one glance what those sheep were. It happened the next fall, better than a year after the sale. A weaver drove down from Chimayo, up north in Rio Arriba County, where they have been weaving wool on the Rio Grande for longer than anyone can rightly say. Her name was Estefana Ortega, and she came from a whole line of Chimayo weavers, and she had spent years trying to find the right wool for the old work. The natural-colored, long-stapled, low-grease wool that the modern fine wool sheep simply did not grow. She had heard, the way word finally reaches the people it is meant for, that there was an old man down in Socorro County running a bunch of the old four-horned sheep. So she drove the whole long way down through Bernalillo and Belen and Socorro and out the Magdalena road to see for herself. Amado met her at the gate. He was wary at first, the way a man gets after a year of being the county joke. But when he brought her into the barn and showed her the wool sacked up in Delfina's back room, that soft brown and silver and near black churro wool sorted and clean, Estefana Ortega put her hands into it and went quiet. And then, and this is the part Amado would tell for years afterward, she began to cry a little, standing there in that dim room, because she had been looking for this exact wool for most of her life and had been told again and again that it was gone. She bought all of it, every sack, and she did not pay him pennies a pound the way the wool buyer in Socorro had offered. She paid him by the pound at a price that made Amado ask her twice if she was sure, because a good hand weaver will pay many times the commodity price for clean, sorted, natural-colored churro wool, since there is almost none of it in the world, and no dye and no mill can make what the sheep grow on their own. She loaded her car until it sat low on its springs, and before she drove off she asked him, please, to save her every pound he sheared for as long as he kept those sheep. And here is what you need to understand. Estefana Ortega went home and told other people. That is how it works with a thing that is truly good and truly rare. She told the other weavers in Chimayo. Word went out along the Rio Grande, and it went out onto the Navajo land to the west, where the weavers had kept the memory of this exact wool alive on their looms for 200 years, and had watched their own old flocks dwindle. And they began to come. Not all at once, but steady, over the next 2 or 3 years. Weavers finding their way down the Magdalena road to the quiet old man with the four-horned sheep, buying his wool by the pound, asking him to hold back the browns, the grays, the good black. The wool the buyer in Socorro had called junk was suddenly the most sought-after thing on Amado Sedillo's whole place, and he could not grow enough of it. But the wool was only half of what turned. The other half was the sheep themselves. Remember how those ewes had lambed in the dry spring, quick and strong, most of them with twins. Well, a flock like that does not stay 24 for long. It grows. By the 3rd year, Amado had better than 100 head out on his hard little place, all of them raised on that dry country, all of them tough and sound and throwing strong lambs of their own. And the four-horned ram that the young fellows at the sale had laughed at and called a devil turned out to be worth more than any animal Amado had ever owned, because a clean, unmixed bloodline of that old breed had become a rare and valuable thing. For here is what was happening in the wider world while Amado worked, and he did not even know it at first. Off in the west there were people, a few scientists and old breed folks and Navajo families, who had realized that the Navajo churro was nearly gone, and had set out, right about those same years, to gather up the last true bloodlines and bring the breed back from the edge. They were combing the whole Southwest for exactly the kind of old, unmixed sheep that most ranchers had culled and killed off years before. And when word reached them that a widower down in Socorro County had bought a whole estate pen of the real thing, and had not only kept it but built it up, sound and clean and thriving, they came to his gate too. A man from a university breed recovery project drove out to Amado's place, walked his sheep, ran his hands over them, looked at that four-horned ram a long time, and told Amado plainly that what he had in that dry pasture was a treasure, one of the cleanest old bands of churro left anywhere, and asked if he would help. They wrote his flock down in their records. They came back for breeding rams to carry the bloodline to other people trying to rebuild it. The sheep nobody would bid on at the tail end of a Saturday sale had become breeding stock that serious people drove hundreds of miles to buy. And the men at the coffee counter in Magdalena, the ones who had laughed. Now here is what you need to understand about them. They did not come and apologize. Men like that mostly never do. But they went quiet. One by one, over those 2 or 3 years, the laughing stopped. Because you cannot go on calling a man a fool while weavers from Chimayo and scientists from off in the west are driving up his road to buy what he raised. They saw the strangers coming. They saw the checks those strangers wrote. They saw those thin, ropey, four-horned culls turn into the soundest, most wanted band of sheep in the whole country, thriving on ground that would have starved their own fine wool flocks. and a quiet settled over the whole subject of Amado Sedillo that was louder, in its way, than all the laughing had ever been. And then one afternoon a truck came up the road that Amado knew well, because he had sold it himself along with the tractor it was hauling. It was Reuben Tafoya, driving Amado's own old gray and red Ford tractor on the trailer behind him. Reuben got out and stood at the gate a while, looking out at that pasture full of tough, sound churro sheep and their strong spring lambs, and he did not quite know how to start. Finally, he took his hat off and said he had a question he had been chewing on for 3 years, and he asked Amado how in the world a man could look at a pen of dying woolies that the whole country had already thrown away and see all of this. Here is something worth knowing. In the late 1970s, breed recovery efforts began gathering the last true Navajo churro sheep from remote flocks across the Southwest. And from perhaps a few hundred purebred animals, the breed was slowly brought back over the following decades. Every rebuilt flock traced back to a handful of old bands that someone, somewhere, had refused to give up on. A single unmixed ram or a pen of overlooked ewes could carry a whole vanishing bloodline forward, which is why the animals dismissed as scrub were, to the people who understood, worth more than any prize. Amado did not answer Reuben Tafoya right away that afternoon. He just looked out at his sheep a while, and then he said only that a man sees what he has spent his life learning to see, and he left it there. But let me tell you how the rest of it went. Because the story did not end at that gate. It went on for years, and it settled into something worth carrying. By the time 5 or 6 more years had passed, the little dry place south of Magdalena had become a name people knew. Weavers came to Amado's gate the way pilgrims come to a well. Estefano Ortega drove down from Chimayo twice a year and never left without her car sitting low with wool. Navajo weavers came in from the west, and Amado would walk them out to the barn and let them choose their own fleeces off the pile, the browns and the grays and the good deep black, and they would sit with him a while and drink coffee and talk about the old days when every family out here had a band of these sheep, and the wool for a whole winter's blankets grew right in the back pasture. The wool buyer in Socorro, the one who had turned Amado's clip away as junk, took to calling now and then to ask if Amado had any extra he would sell. Amado never did. It was all spoken for, every pound, years in advance to the people who understood it. And here is a thing about Amado that tells you who he was. He never bought another tractor. He had the money to buy then, more than enough. But he kept that place small on purpose. He worked it with an old mule and a wagon and his own 2 hands, the way it had been worked when he was a boy, because he had learned something selling that Ford that most men never learn, which is that bigger and faster is not the same as better, and that a man can lose the very thing he is chasing by chasing it too hard. He kept his flock at a size he could know by sight, every ewe, and he tended them himself until his hands could barely close. And he was, by every account of the people who knew him then, a contented man. He gave the good back too. That is the part I do not want you to miss. As his flock grew, Amado began giving breeding lambs away. He gave ewes and young rams to weavers who wanted to start their own small bands. He gave breeding stock to Navajo families out west who were trying to rebuild what their grandmothers had kept, and he would not take a dime for those. He gave lambs to the university project to send on to other people bringing the breed back. He understood better than anyone that a thing this rare does not belong to one man, that the whole point of saving it is to give it away so it can never be lost again through one old widower's fence line. The 24 sheep nobody wanted became, over those years, the seed of I could not tell you how many flocks across the Southwest. And then came the day of the vindication, if you want to call it that, though Amado never used such a word. It was at the Magdalena sale, years after that first fall. And this time the 4-horned churro rams came into the ring not at the tail end of the day to be gotten rid of, but as the sale everyone had driven in for. Word had gone out that Amado Sedillo was selling a few breeding rams off his old bloodline, and the barn was full. Weavers were there, and breed people from 3 states, and the same fine wool men and cattlemen who had laughed 6 or 7 years before were standing at that rail watching the bidding climb. And climb it did. Those rams, out of the very bloodline the auctioneer had once almost knocked down to the killer buyer for pennies, topped that whole sale. The men who had called them goats and devils sat on their hands and watched strangers bid them past anything in the yard. And Amado stood quiet at the rail in his same old canvas coat, and he did not gloat, and he did not so much as smile. He had known what they were worth on the day he bought them. The rest of the country had just taken 7 years to catch up. Now here is the part that matters most. The part I have been carrying this whole story toward. Amado Sedillo grew old on that place, and near the end of it a young man came out to talk with him. A fellow from the university who was writing down the history of the breed and wanted the old rancher's story before it was gone. And the young man asked him the same thing Reuben Tafoya had asked years before at the gate. "How did you see it?" he said. "How did you look at a pen of dying sheep the whole county had given up on and know?" And Amado, who had spent a lifetime not saying much, finally said the thing plain. "Worth is not what a crowd will pay for a thing on a Saturday," he told the young man. "Worth is what the thing truly is, all the way down, whether a single soul ever sees it or not. Those sheep were what they were the whole time they stood in that pen with everybody laughing. The laughing did not change them one bit. All the crowd could see was the dust on them. I could see them because a woman I loved spent 44 years teaching my hands what that wool was, and you cannot laugh a man out of what love has taught him. Patience shows you the rest. You feed a thing, and you tend it, and you wait, and one day everybody else finally sees what was there all along. But it was there all along. He is gone now, Amado Sedillo, buried out there in the dry country beside his Delfina, and the flock long since scattered as seed to 100 other places where the old breed lives on because of him. But if you had gone into that little adobe house in his last years and walked back to the room where Delfina's loom still stood, you would have seen one small thing sitting on the windowsill in the afternoon light. A little oval emblem off an old Ford tractor, the paint worn thin. And set right beside it a single skein of yarn spun from his own sheep, the deep natural brown of the churro, going soft and pale where his fingers had turned it over and over and over. In the quiet, here is a last thing worth knowing. The Navajo churro that were nearly lost are now a recognized heritage breed again, raised across the Southwest for their long natural colored wool and their toughness on dry land. Every band alive today traces back to a few old flocks that somebody refused to give up on. It is an old story, and a true one. What a crowd calls worthless is very often only a thing it has not yet learned to see. And the treasure sits waiting on the one patient soul willing to look.